37,000 feet above the earth. The cabin lights flickered and alarms tore through the hum of engines. A voice cracked through the intercom, trembling, raw with fear. "Any fighter pilot on board? Anyone, please." Passengers gasped. Children shrieked. A woman in 14D clung to her husband's hand as though it were lifeline. But what pushed everyone's blood to boil was this. On that very same flight were two black twin sisters, asleep in economy, who could have been the only salvation all along. They were ignored, dismissed, laughed at. Now 218 lives swung on a precipice, and the world would later learn that those overlooked girls would rewrite everything we believe about courage and competence. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Who were these mysterious black twin sisters sleeping soundly as chaos erupted all around them on Flight 782? How could two girls barely 14 years old possess the kind of knowledge and skill that could rival seasoned military pilots trained in the harshest skies? And perhaps the question that cut deepest of all, why were they mocked, brushed aside, and silenced from the moment they stepped onto that plane? Their quiet confidence dismissed as arrogance, their uniforms mistaken for costumes, their calmness mistaken for indifference? Passengers had laughed, flight attendants had scoffed, and now, in the most critical moment of their lives, every single person on board realized the terrifying weight of their mistake. Because here, in this suspended capsule of fear, two teenagers no one believed in would soon face a test that even the most hardened professionals would hesitate to take on. And yet, what happened after the captain's desperate plea left not only the passengers in shock, but the entire world speechless once this aircraft finally touched down. Stay with me, because the truth of Flight 782 is stranger, darker, and more inspiring than anything Hollywood could make up. Naomi Carter and Nadia Carter, names that would soon echo far beyond the walls of Flight 782, were not ordinary passengers. They were the daughters of Colonel Veronica Carter, a decorated Air Force fighter pilot whose deployments had taken her across the globe, from air bases in Germany to training facilities in Japan, and finally back to Texas, where the twins had spent much of their formative years. Their mother's career had shaped every aspect of their upbringing, instilling in them a resilience and discipline most adults struggle to achieve. From the time they could barely reach the controls, pilots who served alongside their mother had sat them in simulators, astonished at their natural instincts. By the age of 10, Naomi could recite entire aircraft system manuals by memory, her calm and analytical mind processing every line like a machine. Nadia, her mirror in appearance but opposite in temperament, carried a fiery boldness and instinctive reflex that gave her the edge in any flight simulation. Together, the twins were a balance of precision and daring, a pairing no one expected to encounter at 37,000 feet. Yet despite their gifts, Naomi and Nadia faced a constant wall of prejudice. On Flight 782, it began the moment they boarded. A flight attendant bent low with exaggerated cheer, fastening their seatbelts as though they were toddlers on their first ride. A businessman across the aisle smirked, muttering, "Kids don't belong on flights alone." Even when they tried to explain calmly that they were used to traveling without their mother, that their destination was more than just a casual trip, they were brushed off with patronizing smiles. What no one on board could see was the heavy weight on their young shoulders. They were flying across the country to see their grandmother, Dorothy Carter, one final time. Dorothy wasn't just a beloved matriarch. Decades earlier, she had maintained aircraft for the Tuskegee Airmen, the trailblazing black aviators who proved themselves in a world determined to doubt them. For the twins, this trip wasn't simply about family, it was about legacy, about honoring the woman who had inspired their mother, and in turn, had inspired them. But as Flight 782 climbed into the night sky, Naomi and Nadia Carter could never have imagined that the prejudice they endured on this journey would soon collide with a test so terrifying that even their mother's fiercest combat stories would pale in comparison. Flight 782 lifted off from Denver just after sunset, bound for Atlanta with 218 souls on board. The hum of engines and the steady rhythm of flight comforted most passengers, But for Naomi Carter, comfort never came so easily. Seated by the window, her sharp eyes caught something others would miss: the faint reflection of the cockpit indicators bouncing against the glass. She leaned closer, her photographic memory piecing together what she saw. Engine number 2 starboard side was running hotter than it should. Hydraulics too showed fluctuating pressure. To most, it would mean nothing. To Naomi, it was the first whisper of danger. She nudged her sister, Nadia, who shrugged with quiet confidence. "We could handle that," Nadia whispered. But when Naomi flagged down a flight attendant and tried to explain, the woman forced a smile, bending down to her level as if speaking to a child. "Sweetie, don't worry about it. The pilots know what they're doing." Naomi's words were dismissed just like every time before. Minutes later, the turbulence began. At first, it was the familiar rattle that passengers met with nervous laughs. But the storm system they had been warned about earlier was intensifying ahead, and the jolts grew sharper, the air heavier. Drinks spilled, overhead compartments shook, and uneasy eyes darted around the cabin. Naomi clenched the armrest, not out of fear, but from recognition. Something wasn't right. Nadia, braver in spirit, leaned forward, scanning the aisle as if she could somehow see through to the cockpit. In that very cockpit, Captain Daniel Herrera was feeling the same gnawing tension. 2 decades in commercial aviation, years of military training before that, had honed his instincts. He didn't need the red lights blinking on his dashboard to tell him. Flight 782 was in trouble. Hydraulic lines weren't holding steady, and Engine 2 was straining under the pressure of climbing through unstable air. He adjusted, recalibrated, but the storm ahead was unrelenting. The cabin rattled again, harder this time. Gasps filled the air. Children cried. The businessman who had scoffed at the twins earlier now gripped his armrests, white-knuckled. In the back, Naomi tried one last time to catch the attendant's eye, but once again was waved off, her words drowned by the growing hum of panic. And then, it came the sound no passenger ever wants to hear. A metallic groan from the belly of the plane, followed by a shudder that seemed to ripple through the entire fuselage. Captain Herrera glanced at his first officer, both men locking eyes with the unspoken truth. They were losing control. The intercom crackled. His voice came not steady, not commanding, but trembling, edged with fear no passenger had ever heard before. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. If there is any fighter pilot on board, please make yourself known. I repeat, any fighter pilot on board." Gasps erupted through the cabin. Heads turned in disbelief. And all the while, Naomi and Nadia Carter sat frozen in their seats, 2 girls dismissed as children, now realizing the weight of what was about to be asked of them. The cabin of Flight 782 erupted in raw chaos the moment Captain Daniel Herrera's trembling plea echoed through the intercom. Families clutched each other, parents shielding children as if bracing for impact. A businessman in row 8 shouted at the attendants to do something, his voice cracking under fear he couldn't disguise. An elderly woman in the back closed her eyes and whispered rapid prayers, clutching her rosary with white-knuckled hands. For the crew, the thin veneer of professionalism collapsed. Flight attendants who once dismissed worried passengers now rushed frantically up and down the aisles, their own eyes betraying terror. The air inside the cabin felt thick, every gasp and every cry amplifying the sense that time itself was running out. Amidst that storm of fear, Naomi and Nadia Carter leaned close together, their voices low and urgent. "We've trained for this exact failure scenario," Naomi whispered, her analytical mind racing through the checklists drilled into her since childhood. Hydraulic loss combined with thermal stress on Engine 2 if they push too hard. It cascades. Nadia, fiery and instinctive, squeezed her sister's hand. "We can do this, we know how, but they'll never listen." Around them, no one cared to ask why these 2 teenagers seemed so calm, so precise, while everyone else unraveled. When Naomi tried to flag an attendant again, she was waved off sharply. "Sit down, sweetie. We're handling it." The sting of those words was sharp, but sharper still was the knowledge that lives hung on what no one would allow them to prove. Their thoughts drifted, not to themselves, but to who waited on the other side of this flight. Their grandmother, Dorothy Carter, frail and fading, waiting for a final visit that might never come. A woman who had once kept Tuskegee planes in the sky, who had whispered to them as children that their dreams mattered, even when the world told them otherwise. Their mother, Colonel Veronica Carter, thousands of miles away on a deployment, risking her life in silence. Both of them, living embodiments of resilience, of sacrifice, and the twins knew in their bones, we cannot fail. Not tonight. Not on this plane. Not with 218 lives depending on what no one would yet allow them to do. Meanwhile, just beyond the reinforced door of the cockpit, Captain Herrera fought to steady his trembling hands. His first officer barked out checklists, trying desperately to buy time, but every reading on the dashboard screamed disaster. Hydraulic pressure dipping lower. Engine 2 straining harder than it should. The storm outside battering them into violent turbulence. The contrast could not have been sharper up front, trained professionals unraveling under impossible pressure. In economy, 2 dismissed teenagers analyzing, calculating, preparing silently as though their entire lives had been designed for this very hour. And then, it happened. A sound that cut through every cry and prayer in the cabin. A sharp cough, metallic and sickening, followed by a shudder that shook the wings. The second engine, the very one Naomi had warned about, sputtered and began to fail. The lights flickered. The plane lurched violently, pitching forward. In that instant, Flight 782 was no longer simply in trouble, it was on the edge of catastrophe. Captain Daniel Herrera wiped the sweat from his brow. His voice clipped and raw as he barked commands inside the failing cockpit of Flight 782. Warning alarms screamed in his ears, each one more urgent than the last. Engine 2 was no longer reliable. Hydraulics were bleeding out, and fuel lines were now reading erratic. The storm outside clawed at the fuselage, shaking the plane like a toy in a child's hand. The options left to him were vanishing by the second. He could feel it in his bones, time was running out. In the cabin, the panic only deepened. Passengers sobbed, voices rose, and fear spread like wildfire. But in the middle of it all, Naomi Carter finally stood. Her voice, steady but burning with urgency, cut through the chaos. Captain Herrera doesn't have minutes, he has seconds. Engine 2 will completely fail within 5. Hydraulics will follow, and unless you depressurize the auxiliary line now, you'll lose roll control altogether. Her words, rattled off with flawless precision, made the surrounding passengers fall silent for the first time since the alarms began. One of the attendants grabbed her arm, trying to sit her back down. Enough, you're just a kid. But Naomi pulled free, her voice sharper this time. No, I've trained for this. My mother is Colonel Veronica Carter, Air Force. I know exactly what's happening to this plane. Nadia stood beside her, bold and unshaken, her eyes blazing. If you want us all to live, you'd better start listening. Their confidence was jarring, unsettling to adults who had written them off moments ago. Still, the wall of disbelief stood firm until Naomi pulled from her bag a battered notebook. She flipped it open, revealing page after page of meticulous technical diagrams, hydraulic flowcharts, and hand-drawn cockpit schematics. Every wire, every system, every emergency protocol drawn with the kind of detail no teenager should possess. The co-pilot, who had come back to calm the passengers, glanced down and froze. His laughter died in his throat as his eyes darted across the diagrams. He whispered to himself, stunned, This is accurate, down to the redundancies." He looked up at Naomi, then back at the notebook, his skepticism collapsing under the weight of proof. For the first time, it dawned on him that these girls might not only know what they were talking about, they might know more than anyone else on this plane. The hum of passengers shifted from panic to stunned silence, dozens of eyes now fixed on the twins, who moments earlier were dismissed as children. When the co-pilot returned to the cockpit and showed Captain Herrera the notebook, the hardened aviator stared at the sketches, his face tight with disbelief. He saw the auxiliary lines marked, the cascade of failures mapped out in Naomi's neat handwriting, the precise corrective measures already noted. This wasn't a child's fantasy. This was hard, technical truth. Herrera exhaled, his chest heavy, and looked his first officer in the eye. "We're out of options," he muttered. "If we don't try something, we all die." His hand trembled on the intercom switch, his voice now heavy with the gravity of a choice no captain ever thought he'd make. "Bring them forward." Gasps spread through the cabin. Attendants who moments earlier dismissed them now rushed to guide Naomi and Nadia Carter down the aisle. The passengers stared in disbelief as the two 14-year-old girls walked toward the locked cockpit door, their grandmother's legacy and their mother's training coursing through every step. And behind that reinforced door, Captain Herrera prepared himself to hand over the controls of Flight 782 to two teenagers the world had just begun to realize were not ordinary passengers at all. The cockpit of Flight 782 was suffocating with tension as Naomi and Nadia Carter stepped inside, the storm flashing white light across the instruments and alarms wailing like sirens in a burning city. Captain Daniel Herrera slid out of his seat, his jaw tight, his eyes never leaving the two teenagers he was about to entrust with more than 200 lives. Naomi slid into the co-pilot's chair, her calm demeanor almost unnerving, her notebook spread across her lap. "Checklists first," she said firmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone twice her age. She began rattling off the emergency procedures, her photographic memory guiding her through each step as though she had rehearsed this exact moment 1,000 times. Beside her, Nadia moved quickly into action, her hands flying over manual overrides with the instinctive confidence of someone born for the cockpit. Where Naomi thought in systems, Nadia thought in reflexes, her body reacting faster than the storm could throw them off course. Together, they worked as one. Naomi stabilized the hydraulics by rerouting secondary flow, her voice steady and precise. Auxiliary pressure online, adjust pitch trim, reduce load. Nadia gripped the yoke, feeling the fight of the aircraft, guiding the massive plane through sheets of turbulence with the instinctive touch of a natural pilot. Every lurch of the storm met her counterforce, every drop matched by her swift correction. The passengers crammed in the cabin behind them could only cling to their armrests and each other. Prayers spilled into the air, whispers of hope tangled with sobs of despair. A child asked if they were going to die, his mother pressing his head into her chest, too shaken to answer. A businessman who had once scoffed at the twins now muttered desperate words, his face buried in his hands. And then, slowly, impossibly, the aircraft began to steady. The alarms quieted. The shuddering eased. For the first time in what felt like hours, the passengers felt the faintest sense of balance return to the cabin. Naomi and Nadia's voices overlapped in a rhythm born from years of training together, one thinking 3 steps ahead, the other reacting with instinct in real time. Captain Herrera, watching from the side, whispered under his breath, "My God, they're actually doing it." Outside, the storm still raged, but inside the cockpit, order was returning. The impossible was unfolding before their very eyes. Minutes later, the city lights of Atlanta pierced the darkness below. Naomi's voice remained calm, guiding her sister through final procedures. "Landing gear manual deploy. Flaps at 15. Keep her steady." Nadia nodded, her grip tightening as she angled the massive aircraft into its descent. The passengers held their breath as the runway loomed closer, the engines sputtering but holding, the hydraulics groaning under the strain. And then impact. The wheels slammed into the tarmac with a screech that echoed through every soul on board. For a split second, silence reigned. And then, as the plane rolled to a shuddering but safe stop, the cabin erupted. Applause thundered, cries of relief spilled into the air, strangers embraced, and tears streamed freely. But Naomi and Nadia Carter did not soak in the applause, did not turn for praise. Their eyes were fixed only on one thing, the destination that had mattered all along. Hours later, in a quiet hospital room in Atlanta, the twins stood by the bedside of their grandmother, Dorothy Carter. Frail and fading, her eyes shimmered with both pride and exhaustion as she reached for their hands. She had heard what they had done. The world already had, but her voice was barely above a whisper, her words carrying the weight of a lifetime. Baby girls, the sky was never your limit. It was your calling. Naomi and Nadia leaned close, tears spilling freely. Not from fear this time, but from the truth of legacy fulfilled. For them, Flight 782 was not just survival, it was the moment when the world was finally forced to see them. Not as children, not as passengers, but as pilots born of a lineage of courage. The cabin of Flight 782 was still trembling with the echoes of what had just happened. Passengers sat wide-eyed, some clutching hands, others still whispering prayers of thanks. Yet amid the chaos, amid the flood of relief, Naomi Carter and her twin sister Nadia Carter remained quiet. Their gazes were fixed not on the applause, not on the weeping strangers who owed them their lives, but on the future they had silently prepared for all along. For them, this moment wasn't about being noticed. It was about living up to everything their grandmother, Dorothy Carter, had instilled in them: courage, precision, and a belief that their voices and their hands could command the sky. The news spread like wildfire. Reporters descended on Hartsfield-Jackson Airport within the hour, headlines already racing across television screens. Teen twins save flight from disaster. But inside, in the quietest corners of the hospital where Dorothy lay resting, none of that mattered. The applause of millions couldn't match the trembling smile on her face as she whispered, "Baby girls, the sky was never your limit. It was your calling." Naomi and Nadia clung to her words, their tears falling not in fear this time, but in recognition of who they had always been. And so, as the story of Flight 782 passed into legend, one truth remained clear. Two girls, everyone ignored, two teenagers, most had dismissed, became the reason 218 strangers lived to see another sunrise. They weren't pilots with decades of logged hours. They weren't veterans of the cockpit. They were simply Naomi and Nadia Carter young, underestimated, and extraordinary. Two girls everyone ignored became the reason 218 strangers lived to see another sunrise. Heroes come in all ages, all colors, and sometimes in the most underestimated forms. But let me ask you, if you had been on Flight 782, would you have trusted them? Or would you have doubted too? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you thought this story was unbelievable, wait until you hear the next one we uncovered. Subscribe so you never miss these true survival stories.